Do we know what kind of diseases were found in America before the Europeans?
Now, this is going to require a little bit of a nerdy response
Oh,
because,
you are in the right place.
okay,
You've reached American History Hotline. You ask the questions, we get the answers. Leave a message.
Hey there, American History Hotliners. Bob Crawford here, thrilled to be joining you again for another episode of American History Hotline. It's the show where you ask the questions, and the best way to get us a question is on our website. That's AmericanHistoryHotline.com, AmericanHistoryHotline.com. Today's question comes from Christian. He writes, I've never really understood why disease wiped out so many of the native people, but not the colonists. Was it because indigenous people had no exposure to the diseases like smallpox, or is that an oversimplification? Thanks for the question, Christian. I love it, and we found the perfect expert to answer it for you today. Joining me now is Charles C. Mann. He's a journalist and author, including the book 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus. His new podcast is Everyday Abundance, which he co-hosts with Virginia Postrel. Charles, thanks for joining us today.
very happy to be here. And that's like a great question from Christian.
Excellent question. Let's dive into it. Okay, big fan of your book. I want to get to Christian's question, but first, let's start with America before Europeans arrived. People might have a few questions about the nomadic tribes that existed at that time, but there were actually massive metropolitan areas here, right? What was America like before the 1490s in a population sense?
So when you say the Americas, you're talking about a whole continent. So imagine if you were somehow in an airplane, flying over the Americas, and we'll start in New England because that's where I live. And what you would have seen were small groups of villages that were rapidly consolidating into larger groups, but were still mostly small groups of villages. Then if you went to the Southwest, you would see societies getting bigger and bigger, but until you got to the Mississippi Valley, and you would see tens of thousands of ceremonial centers with big pyramids in them, kind of like the pyramids in Egypt. If you went into the actual Southwest itself, you would see the Pueblo societies, who lived in these kind of giant apartment buildings, if you like, very packed together groups of people. Go further south and you get into really large societies, that most famous of which is called the Aztec Empire. That's a 19th century invention. It was really an alliance of three different groups of people. And so maybe a better name is the Triple Alliance that had this empire. Right up north of them was the Purepecha, who had their own empire. Then there's lots and lots of Maya kingdoms. You go further south into the Andes, and you have the Inca, this very rapidly rising imperial power, had in some ways, the largest empire in the world at the time. It stretched, their Inca road network stretched over a distance that's equivalent between Stockholm and Cairo, all along the spine of the Andes. And then if you curved into the Amazon, this is a very exciting story in archaeology that's just being discovered, now. You would find all kinds of urban complexes up and down the tributaries of the Amazon. So it was really a crowded, bustling, thriving place that, if you were an alien coming from Mars, it wouldn't have seemed that different from something in Western Europe or Asia.
Do we know what kind of diseases were found in America before the Europeans?
Yes. Now, this is going to require a little bit of a nerdy response because
you are in the right place.
Okay, because the instant you talk about types of diseases, you start getting into medical terminology. Okay, and so a big difference there's in diseases there are two types that are called zoonotic, and then just everything else. And zoonotic diseases are the ones that were originally animal diseases, and they mutated and do what scientists call jumping the species barrier and became human diseases. And almost all of the big killers in human history are those. And so you think of smallpox, which originally was probably camelpox. You think of tuberculosis. Well, actually, tuberculosis is a peculiar thing. So let's set tuberculosis aside. Flu, which originally came from poultry, and on and
Charles,
on.
can we put SARS into this category?
Yes, exactly. Okay. And very probably Ebola, and quite possibly COVID. Of course, that's a big
SARS.
dispute.
That's part of SARS, right?
Yeah, right. It's a different kind of. So all of these are zoonotic, generally zoonotic diseases, and understandably, people contract diseases from animals they spend a lot of time with. And so if you have camels in the Middle East, a camel disease has the maximum opportunity to jump into the human disease through mutation. And that's where, presumably smallpox came from. Now, by a quirk of evolutionary history that would require further nerding out, and I'm happy to do it if you want.
Look, Charles,
Charles,
I'm going to interrupt for a joke.
Yeah.
But a real joke. My goal is for people to listen to this show and do better on Jeopardy.
Okay. So, by a quirk of evolutionary history, there were very few domesticable animals in the Americas. So we didn't have cattle, we didn't have horses, we didn't have goats, we didn't have sheep, or their analogs, except in the Andes, there was llamas and cunas and so forth, but only up in the Andes. And most of the rest of the continent, there just weren't candidates for domestication. And so you could say, well, what about deer or something like that? And all attempts that people made to domesticate deer, they just wouldn't do it. They'd just batter themselves. The same thing is true for bison. Now with modern technology, you can do these kinds of things. But, up in the great bulk of human history, there weren't these kinds of animals in the Americas. And as a result, people didn't spend much time around them, whereas European and Asian and African farmers were constantly with their cattle and their horses and their sheep and their goats and so forth. We over here, meaning Americans, were not. And the result was that there was a great buildup of zoonotic diseases in Europe and Asia and Africa, and next to none here. There's a couple of significant exceptions, tuberculosis being the big one. And that was actually an old world disease that came to South America, probably carried by seals. So it's a human disease that became a seal disease that became a human disease because people in Tierra del Fuego ate the seals. I mean, that's the thought. It's still tricky, knowing this to be sure, but that's the general theory now. Anyway, the point is that there's a big difference, in the burden of disease between one hemisphere and the other. And if you want to think about it, what Columbus did and the people who followed him, it was as if they brought all those diseases over, and then all the suffering and death that those diseases had caused over the centuries in Europe and Asia and Africa were compressed into a couple hundred years here in the Americas.
Okay, so let's go there. So Europeans start coming over in big waves in the early 1600s. What diseases or illnesses did they bring with them?
It may be that the first was malaria. Malaria is a fascinating disease, and they brought over some African slaves, and it's quite possible that as early as 1493 in Columbus's second voyage, they brought over malaria. But the big one was smallpox. And
you say this originally comes from camels?
Yeah, possibly. There's a lot of, this is the kind of thing that there's a lot of argument about. I believe camels is the current reigning theory, but one of the things about theories is that they get disproven from time to time as people have new discoveries. But probably camels. It gets much more virulent for reasons that aren't completely clear a few hundred years before Columbus. And so this virulent type of smallpox is the type that is brought into the Americas, and it comes with Cortez. Hernan Cortez is the guy, the conquistador who's in the Caribbean, in the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. He gets a small expedition, sails to Mexico, and proceeds to invade the Aztec Empire, or the Triple Alliance. To make a long and complicated and fascinating story very short, his initial foray doesn't work out. I gather you had Matthew Restall here.
That's
He
right.
probably told you about how the story that we hear about these small band of people conquering, the mighty Aztecs isn't really what actually happened. I won't add any much more onto that, except to say that the Spaniards are initially beaten back. They come back. They get a whole ton of native allies. But what really helps them is that as they get some reinforcements from the Caribbean, they bring in smallpox, and smallpox sweeps through Mesoamerica, which is this highly populated, densely populated region between sort of just north of Mexico City and Central America. It's one of the most densely packed places in the world. Densely populated urban places are just great for spreading disease, and nobody's ever seen smallpox or even any diseases like it. And as a result, it just cuts through this area. Untreated smallpox kills something like 30 or 40% of its victims. And we had enormous havoc in the United States from just having 1 million, which is a third of 1% of our people die from COVID. Now imagine 100 times that many, 1 out of every 3 people or 1 out of every 4 people around you dying very rapidly. And Cortez and his allies walk in while the chaos is happening. And so I would argue that disease is the key reason for the Spanish victory in the conquest of the Aztecs or the Triple Alliance.
So was this the first European caused epidemic in America? Would you say that?
Sorry, it's possible there is a smaller one in the Caribbean in the 1490s, in 1493, but this is certainly the first major one. And it seems like it spread south and into the Inca Empire. And when shortly after that, the Spaniards went into the Inca Empire, they discovered that it had just been ravaged by a disease that sounds like smallpox that had actually killed the emperor and much of his court and led to a successional war, a civil war. And the Spaniards walked into this empire that had been ravaged by successional civil war and disease, and it made it very easy for them to horn their way in.
So these diseases come from Europe, from Europeans. Did the outbreaks affect the native populations the same as European settlers, or did European settlers have built up immunity at this point to these diseases?
Yeah, so there's 2 kinds of immunity. There's genetic immunity. And an example of that is that people in Central and West Africa have lived with malaria for so long that their bodies have built up various genetic defense mechanisms against it. The most famous is sickle cell anemia, and people with 1 copy of this particular gene have differently shaped red blood cells that are hard for the parasite to invade, which is what malaria does. It invades your red blood cells. So that's genetic immunity. The other kind of immunity is acquired immunity. And that's when, if you get chicken pox and you survive it, you're immune for a long time. Same thing with measles and so forth. And most Spaniards at the time had these childhood diseases, one of which at the time was smallpox. And as a result, they were immune to these epidemics. Now, the interesting thing is that their kids would not have been, right? Because they wouldn't have acquired immunity. And so the settlers' kids died at the same rate as native people, but they themselves were this sort of lucky generation in this way.
Thinking about the great dying of 1617 to 1619, thinking about the Pilgrims.
Right.
Talk about this, the Pilgrims bringing illness and the great dying.
So the Pilgrims probably didn't bring the illness, but there were people, Europeans who came to the coast, to the New England coast. There were French people.
Okay, wait. I got to stop you just for clarity. So you're saying the Pilgrims didn't bring these diseases?
No, not that great dying did. Okay. That happened just before they arrived.
Okay.
So there were various ships that came there. The Pilgrims are important because they created the first long-lasting permanent settlements in New England. But lots of traders had been there, including famous people like La Salle, the French explorer. And if you have a disease and you're on a long trip, the disease will, as they say, burn itself out. Everybody will get sick and either die or survive. And if the trip is long enough, the disease will burn itself out and won't be present. And so one of the tricks about in those days is that it took something like 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic, and so somebody had to come on with an early stage of the disease, and then there had to be a passenger who didn't have it, and so forth. And there had to be enough people who hadn't had the disease to have a chain of infection that would let you have a fresh case when you came on land. And that eventually happened, both for the Spaniards in 1519 and for in New England, when it seems like a French crew shipwrecked in, I believe, 1616 on Cape Cod, and somebody had an illness. There's been a speculation that it was viral hepatitis that infected people, again, who had no experience with this kind of communicable disease, and it spread through all of coastal New England. It was barred around Buzzards Bay, which is the big bay in Rhode Island, because the Narragansett and the people to their east in Cape Cod didn't get along, so that there was a kind of a natural frontier, and probably the same thing to the north, where the Abenaki and the various peoples of Massachusetts also had some issues. So all along coastal Massachusetts, this terrible disease came, and that was what the Pilgrims sailed into. They sailed into a place that had been recently emptied, if you follow, and they established their town right on top of an abandoned native village, abandoned because of disease.
This is American History Hotline. I'm your host, Bob Crawford. Today, my guest is Charles C. Mann. He's a journalist and author, including the book 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus. He also wrote 1493, Uncovering the New World Columbus Created. His new podcast is Everyday Abundance, which he co-hosts with Virginia Postro. We're talking about disease in the early days of Europeans arriving in America. Who got sick? Who didn't? Why? Remember, send us your burning questions about American history. You can do that on our website, AmericanHistoryHotline.com. That's AmericanHistoryHotline.com. Now back to the show. I've seen numbers saying that 90% of the native population in America died between 1616 and 1619. That's a scale I can't imagine. Is that true? And do we have firsthand accounts of what that period was like?
So that's not true, because that's too short of a period of time.
Okay.
That would, the 1616 to 1619, that was in New England, in coastal New England. And we don't know what percentage, but there were a bunch of villages that were abandoned because everybody died.
Right.
And when the Pilgrims landed, and they first landed on Cape Cod, they found graves and bodies everywhere, and they saw that there had been a catastrophe. Was it 90%? Was it 60%? We don't know, but it was terrible. What we can say is that between, say, 1520 and say about 1850, something like 90% died. But that was all these things were entangled with each other. And one thing that's important is that people are more likely to die of disease if they're in poor health and have been mistreated. And there was
Right.
an awful lot of mistreatment and slavery and so forth that made populations very vulnerable. So when historians talk about this, they say, yes, disease, you know, killed all these people, but it was entangled with the colonial history, which in many cases was not good, shall we say.
No, it's terrible, in fact.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, how did the Pilgrims interpret the massive die off of the native population in their time? Like, I've seen it referred to as a wonderful, quote unquote, wonderful plague.
Yeah. So you have to remember that neither Europeans nor native people had a modern understanding of disease. For both of them, disease was a supernatural thing. It was a reward or punishment by God. It had to do with whether you had been good or bad. It had to do with whether your society was operating right. It was very much a moral thing. And so both sides kind of interpreted when they saw that the disease disproportionately affected one side more than the other, it was hard for them not to draw spiritual lessons from that and say, we must have done something wrong, or conversely, we must have done something right. And, the idea that they could have brought it was just sort of dimly present, the idea. And so you see things like, in of Plymouth Plantation, I think it is, William Bradford, the governor, talks about it pleased God to sweep them away. I think that language is in there and also in his letters. And so they saw it as this celestial event that showed that they were being favored. And, today, now that we know about bacteria and so forth, this seems appalling, but it was really very much of the time.
You mentioned the other uh, factors, right?
Mm-hmm.
In
Yeah.
these in the life of the
Right.
in the existence of the native populations.
Right.
Would they have fared better, do you think, ultimately, if they weren't also involved in warfare with European settlers and being displaced from their homes and having their social structures destroyed?
Well, it seems, obviously you can't go back and run an experiment or something, but it seems very likely, doesn't it? I mean, consider the Pueblo who lived in in the Southwest in what is now New Mexico. Um, the Spaniards come in the early 17th century in 1600, can't remember if it's 1607 or 1608 or 1609, but right about there. And between then and about 1680, the Spaniards are just terrible. They enslave, they exploit, they do, and then there's this huge revolt in 1680 in which the Pueblo kick out the Spaniards. But during that time, something like 50 Pueblo villages disappeared. They're just not there because their entire populations either died or were enslaved or just fled to another place for protection. And so we can say there's something like 2/3 of all the Pueblo died. But how do we disentangle the impacts of multiple waves of disease, multiple waves of slavery, and just multiple waves of famine and just plain old mistreatment?
Did any of the native nations do better than the others? Were there any
Sure.
that give us an example?
Um, and they better for time than others. But for example, a number of the nations in Mexico allied with the Spaniards because they didn't like the Triple Alliance.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, there was a nation called Tlaxcalan that had been fighting the Triple Alliance for just decades. And when the Spaniards came, they joined up and said, let's get these guys. Empires are never very popular with their subjects, right? And they prospered. They became an independent state. They weren't formally incorporated into Mexico until 1857. If you look at old maps of Santa Fe, there was a Spanish colony and a Tlaxcalan colony. right across the river, the Santa Fe River, from each other. And in fact, during this Pueblo revolt, one of the first things the Pueblo did was kick out all these guys from central Mexico. So that would be an example. Another way of doing well was the Comanche, or the Numanu, which is a closer version of their name. They pretty clearly realized that these colonists were bad news, and so they did these appalling stage massacres, show violence to scare the living crap out of them. And they created this area called Comancheria that Europeans basically weren't welcome in, and they staved off the European advance for a couple hundred years. So there's all kinds of people who struggled and survived. And then when you go to reservations today, you'll see people who will quite commonly tell you, you guys threw everything you had at us and we're still here. And they very much are.
This is kind of well, let's talk about this for a minute. Like, at what point does this stabilize, or does it ever stabilize?
Well, human societies aren't well known for being stable. So one way to think about it is that about 1900 was the absolute, nadir, the bottom, and there were just, I don't know, something like 250,000 native people in North America, something like that. And now there's millions. So the populations have been on the rise, and in fact, some of the most rapidly increasing people in North America are native people. And the difference in native societies, in North America between when I was a kid growing up in the Pacific Northwest, and you would see just terrible things on there with real abject poverty, and today is just enormous. Now, I'm not going to say that there's no problems in Native America. No person would say that, but the difference between now and 50 years ago is absolutely incredible.
People may not realize, we've had Catherine Oliverius on here.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know Catherine's work?
I know her name, yeah.
She talks about how malaria drove the transatlantic slave trade and plantation economies. Do you want to touch on that? Because it feels kind of related to this.
Sure. I mean, and it's something I actually cover in the book 1493 a little bit. So those diseases were carried by mosquitoes. Malaria and yellow fever were the two big mosquito-borne diseases. Both of them are carried by specific types of mosquito. So malaria is carried by mosquitoes in the genus Anopheles. And it turns out there's 4 members of that genus already here. The one in the eastern part of the United States is Anopheles quadrimaculatus. And all you had to have was a person with malaria coming here, gets bit, and the mosquito is ready to transmit it to other people. So, so the east coast of the United States, kind of below Washington or Baltimore, through Florida and Louisiana, became rife with malaria. Now, people from West Africa, typically in those days, both had genetic mutations against malaria, several of them, not just sickle cell, and also had often had it as a child, which confers mild cases, which can confer some immunity. And so just bear in mind, it's something like 95% of the population over there. Now you have an English guy, and he's coming over. He won't have those mutations. He won't have those. And if you're a plantation owner, you need labor. Native people don't want to do it. There is a robust Indian slave trade, but they know the countryside better than you do. They escape. So you're not allowed to enslave English people, but what you are allowed to do is have indentured servants. You pay for their passage. They work for you for 7 years, or 5 years, and then you have to let them go and do it. Or you can bring in slaves. The slaves are more expensive than the indentured people, but they don't have the option, of leaving, and you don't have to pay them, and we're just going to sort of skip all the moral objections here. We're just
Sure.
looking at this like in a cold-hearted, economic way, because obviously on a moral level, they're not the same. But the plantation owner, it looks at this and says, on top of that, when the English person gets here, he's going to get malaria and has to go through a process of what they call seasoning. And seasoning means for, 5 months to a year, that guy's sick in bed with malaria and not doing anything for you. When you look like this, it's really tilts the scales in favor of slavery. A slave is a better bargain for you. Again, strictly speaking, economically, than the indentured servant. And so it gives a big nudge towards slavery. Yellow fever comes in on top of that. Yellow fever is a disease that if you get it when you're a child, it's like chickenpox. You're fine. You get it when you're an adult, and it's very high mortality. I've seen figures like 75%. It's a death sentence. And it is carried by a particular type of mosquito, Aedes aegypti, and it gets brought over to the Americas, probably in water casks for ships. And so there's these recurrent waves of yellow fever. And this is one reason these Caribbean colonies in particular have a tiny number of slave owners there, and then a vast supply of freshly brought over Africans because they're working on a sugar plantation. Europeans, they've had yellow fever. They're immune. They're genetically superior in this way. The Europeans are, trying to, not to get sick the entire time they're there. And again, this also puts the thumb on the scales and really is an impetus for the transatlantic slave trade.
This is just fascinating, Charles. I really appreciate your time today. I've been talking with Charles C. Mann. He's a journalist and author, including of the book 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus, and 1493, Uncovering the New World Columbus Created. Both books are excellent. His new podcast is Everyday Abundance, which he co-hosts with Virginia Postrel. Charles, thanks for joining us today on American History Hotline.
Oh, it's my pleasure talking with you.
Thank you.